Right, well, thanks so much for having me and for coming tonight and fighting the cold. Tonight, in talking about posthuman and internationalism, and the lecture or talk is going to be split into two parts. And the first is to discuss what appears to be pretty much the comedy of the post-natural and the post-human, right? We work on these models all the time and try to figure out what the future is going to look like if humanity becomes a decentered entity. And what seems to come up really is it becomes a good excuse for more types of science fiction. So first, I want to entertain these categories of the posthuman and end with internaturalism in the second half and use some of the projects that I've done as a way to illustrate the possibility of it, right? Internaturalism, as we'll see, has its own problems, but it is at least in a tactical sense or in an operational sense a plausible possibility to what a posthuman world could look like. That is, one in which humans are not the center of the universe and the measure of all things. Let's start with one of the very popular models, cyborgs. And we know that this has been around since the early 60s, but when it really kind of gained in popularity and made its way into popular iconography was in the 80s. Right, and our cyborgs being when we fully integrate technology and the flesh, and that they function as a single being. Now, theoretically, it sounds very plausible that that's what's going to happen. We live in a very intense technosphere, and as we all know, we're very attached to our technologies, right? They're very hard for us to put down. But whether they could actually be integrated with our organic form, I think is a little questionable. As long as it remains separate, that is the technology from the organic form, then it's quite plausible. But I wouldn't really call that a cyborg. And from the time of the 80s to the present, the advancement of a cyborg, in spite of the fact it could happen, is not happening. And so we need to ask the question why. So let's start with the first significant distinction, and that's between our first order and second order cyborgs. Right? A second order cyborg, I'm willing to concede, is probably everyone in this room. And as I look around the room and see like lots of people have their phones right at the ready, right? They never, if you want to see a group of people get very anxious, tell them you're going to confiscate their phones and their computers, right? They've got to just, in order to come to this lecture, you have to give those up. No. There's just too much anxiety if you have to surrender your technology. So in this sense, we could say, well, yes, there's kind of an integrated relationship between the body and the technology that serves that body. But it's not really like that yet. It's not really RoboCop or a T-800. Right? They're not really fully integrated together. Now, the closest we get with the second order is with the military. Right? Our individual troopers really, in every sense, are integrated with their technology, whether it's body armor, vision machines, kill capability. All of these things function together with that soldier. And so again, we can say, perhaps this is what a cyborg will look like. But it's not fully integrated in that the technology and the flesh cannot be separated, that one requires the other, that it is truly a symbiotic relationship. And that never seems to really make its way forward, this particular symbiosis. We can increase the intensity in terms of the relationship between the body and technology, but that separability never stops. We always have to be able to put it down, even though we might not necessarily want to. Right? If you've ever seen like a good video game junkie, they can play for hours and hours and hours. Right? Don't necessarily want to ever put it down. So given this situation of whether we could become real integrated cyborgs, I would say it's going to be incredibly difficult. And the reason is there's, among other things, but for our purposes, a cultural barricade, a veritable bulwark against an actual integration. Now, some of you may be saying that there are first-order cyborgs up there. Like, how about someone that has a pacemaker? Or someone that has a cochlear implant? Are these not integrated forms? And the answer is, of course, yes. But I would say, okay, technically, we can check off integration between technology and the body. But conceptually, I think it's very incorrect that we're still a step away from true cyborg existence. Why do I think this? And this is important to the point of the cultural bulwark. That a pacemaker or a cochlear implant does not change the human condition, it reinforces the human condition. That is, people are being brought back to the norm, right? So if I have a pacemaker put in, it's because my heart's not working very well. It's going to lead to medical problems. If I want to come back to the norm of a consistently beating heart, I use this mechanism. What that is doing, as I said, is reinforcing the norm of what a human heart should do. It's not taking away from it. Conceptually speaking, it's not building a model of a post-human model of what humans could become, right? Of evolving them into something different. It's stabilizing the model. And it's making it more homogeneous, more normative. It's cutting down on diversity and what could eventually evolve into a breaking away from the standardized human condition that we all know now. And so that's kind of why I remain somewhat skeptical. None of us are turning into the $6 million man yet. If we want to count getting a pacemaker as being a cyborg, I would say that we would be very pathetic cyborgs. It's certainly not a post-human transition. We're not like the old bionic man here. Now, what is then this cultural barricade that stops us? Because, theoretically, it all sounds great. Wouldn't we like some kind of technology that could integrate with us so we could think faster and better, something that would make our bodies last longer, make them more agile, make them stronger, whatever the value of the day might be? Wouldn't we want to have that? And I think the answer is we love it as a fantasy, but we hate it as a reality, because we are so invested in the status quo of the model of what it means to be human. Some of you might know this project by the Iraqi artist Wafa Bilal, Third Eye. And what he wanted to do was a surveillance project, especially being Iraqi and at the time living in the US. And he wanted to be able to photograph where he was at all times and transmit those photographs to the internet, in a sense challenging whatever surveillance authority that might be watching him, and I'm sure some were. They would always know where he is. It was kind of an inverse strategy of, rather than trying to stay invisible, to go the opposite way and be completely visible all the time, generating reams and reams of data that would be much more difficult to go through. So how did this go for him? Well, first he couldn't find a doctor that would install the bracket in the back of his skull that would hold the camera. That took him a long time, but he finally did. He finally got a doctor that agreed. It was like, okay, for art, I will install this in the back of your head, but if it was for any other reason, this would not be an ethical practice. So he got it installed, but then think, I mean, it's always, think what happens when an unfamiliar form of surveillance appears. People get, again, very anxious, right? It's the anxiety and panic of the 21st century. Surveillance that's not familiar. Now, familiar surveillance, we seem to have all around here and almost everywhere I go, regardless of country or culture, that seems fine. I mean, I don't know if anyone's worried about the cameras in this room. And most certainly, anyone can take out their phone anytime they want and start taking pictures. That seems to be fine. But this kind, the kind that's unfamiliar, that's off the norm, that's not something we see every day, that's not mundane or routinized, that's not expected, there's a problem. And poor Wafa, at numerous institutions he went to, and he was also a professor at New York University, had to always take it off. There would be complaints, they would get filed, and the judgment would always be, you can't come into this institution with that camera taking pictures every minute. So what does that say about our possibilities of getting to any position where the model of a cyborg would make sense? That even though we're surrounded by cameras all the time, when we see something like this, when it's kind of integrated, it's not even very integrated. It's just attached to them. It sets off a kind of alarm bell. I mean, most certainly the greatest economic failure that is in this line of product is Google Glass. It just did not work out. Why? It's not any different from our phones, but people wearing the camera on their eyes. There was just something about that was too unfamiliar, too alien. And so, one, many people wouldn't wear it, or two, they objected when other people did. No one knew what kind of vision machine was going on in that glass. Right? And these are things that come off. We're not even getting to something like Wafa does that couldn't be removed. So poor Google Glass. Our friend Stellark, who we all know, he's been trying to convince people of this model now for, 30 years at least. And I don't know if he's making any advancement. This particular project shows a great deal of problems. First, he couldn't find for 2 years a doctor that would do this experiment with him. They were all saying it's not ethical. There's no reason for there to be a medical intervention if we're putting an ear on your arm. Now, these same doctors might just as quickly done a facelift or liposuction. But an ear on the arm, that's kind of weird. It's out of the norm. Can't really undo it. But Stellark wanted it. And he also wanted it, and this was the really problematic part, was he wanted a mechanism inside that would pick up the noise of the environment in which he was in, and that noise could be transmitted so that other people could listen through his third ear. Now, though that mechanism was small and could fit in the ear rather easily, it was recognized by his body as not part of his body very quickly. And that caused a very serious infection that almost killed him. So that's problem number 2, is that we don't really have the surgical science and the understanding of the body's immune system that we can start putting foreign objects into ourselves. And if we're so alienated from that idea to begin with, how could we ever really see that ever happening? Again, there's a kind of cultural protection from, on one hand, the existential threat, and on the other hand, a genuine medical threat, and yet again, medical ethics, which tend to keep them pulled back from that which is weird, right? That which is out of the norm. So it's going to be hard to push this model. Now, the final problem, and we can see it in both of these projects, is that we tend to have a belief in flexible identity, right? And doing some type of technological intervention into the body is disruptive to that. Now, there are other ways we can do it, like very popular over the past 15 years or so, tattoos. Now they can kind of be removed, but mostly they're not. Mostly when you get tattooed, it's there. But it functions within flexibility. That there is a kind of arc of identity possibilities that you can have a tattoo, but still flow through this series of identity possibilities. When you get your implant of one kind or another, if it was truly a cyborgian type, your identity is going to be you're the cyborg guy. Right? There's a couple of them out there. We know them. It really stops that kind of flexibility that people value, the idea that they can change over time and become other people. It seems to disrupt their, whether it really would is another question, but it seems to disrupt a very valued flow in the nature of how we look at ourselves. Right? This is, this points to how strong the model of being human actually is. That we have set up kind of all of these barriers that keep at least this particular form of the posthuman out. Okay, how many are familiar with this man? Aubrey de Grey. He's one of the leaders of the Immortals movement. Aubrey is of the opinion that under the right circumstances, humans could live forever. Right? it's kind of like the cyborg. It's theoretically possible, but it seems very improbable. In only this time for a very different reason. One is because of the research that's needed. Now, Aubrey gets a lot of unfortunate criticism, right? That you get a lot of folks saying, the idea of immortality, it's probably not a good idea. What if people start living forever? What is that going to mean for the population? What is that going to mean for resource distribution? I suppose these are theoretical problems that could be discussed, but I don't see them as operational concerns, right? If one thing that humans tend to grab onto very quickly, and I could almost make a blanket statement and say almost universally, is that if it will make you live longer, humans generally will accept it. Right? If it's something that staves off death, that's usually a pretty popular product. The birthing end, that's a whole nother story. That's where the controversies always are. But at the death side, arguing about it, if Aubrey actually was successful in his quest for immortality, I'm sure lots of people would sign on. It's, this is an interesting part, is unfortunately dying seems to be one of the great destabilizers of the human model. We don't want to do it. And yet at the same time, one of the things that fundamentally makes us human, that universally makes us human, is everybody has to die. So what would happen? It's a great post-human model. What would happen if you really could remove death from the equation? I think that would definitely make for a new stage in human evolution if death was taken out of the picture. Now, what do we have to do in order to do it? Well, unfortunately, our metabolism makes for ongoing damage, and as damage adds up, it leads to pathology, and hence why we have to die eventually. But we know what those problems are. They've been identified. We know what kills us. We've done well on that, right? So cell loss and atrophy, that's one. Junk that gets inside our cells and junk that collects outside our cells, meaning something like plaque, right? We know that plaque in the arteries is a bad thing. It clogs up. It leads to heart attacks. It leads to strokes. But we don't know why the body's making it. We don't know how to get it to stop. It's just in there. Then, of course, there's one of our perennial worries, particularly of those who are ecologically minded, of the number of chemicals that we're exposed to. And they get in our body, and our body doesn't know how to get rid of them. They're in there to stay and to do whatever damage they're going to do, particularly as they collect more and more over the years. Death-resistant cells, that's usually a problem. And then, of course, there's mutations, right? Both DNA mutations and nuclear mutations, right? That which messes up the mitochondrial. When those energy machines are not working, we tend to die pretty quickly. We don't know how to repair the chromosomes. That's a problem. And finally, epimutations. Well, and protein crosslinks, too. That's nasty. That clogs up your blood system as various proteins that shouldn't attach together do attach together. So Aubrey knows the list of what's going to kill us. And he's like, well, if we just fix all that, then theoretically, humans could live forever. The problem is, we are miles away from fixing all this. We do not know enough about biology to be able to work with almost any of it. Now Aubrey's convinced, and remember, he's a money raiser, right? He has a center. You got to believe in your product if you're going to raise money. So he'll say all kinds of stuff. Like, you know, he suspects that in 15 years, we'll have the first great breakthrough. That'll maybe push us up to 100 as an average age. That seems very unlikely. People that are going to make it to 100 are probably going to do it because of predispositions in their genes that they have already, right? You know, assuming they don't die in a car wreck or something like that. So, I'm very skeptical about this. It sounds like a worthwhile project, but the amount of science and the amount of research that it's going to take to get over that mountain, I would say, is somewhat akin to us having a colony on the moon or a colony on Mars. And even the colony on the moon might be more likely than this. Right? The probability seems extraordinarily low that in any of our lifetime here sitting in this room that we will reap the benefits of immortality, if indeed that ever really happens. That the list of the 6 naughty things, the 6 things that are going to kill us, can somehow be neutralized, right? I see the immortality more as a kind of neo-biblical promise that comes to us, a kind of utopian rhetoric that has been secularized, but taken and changed from biblical work, right? But it's there to sell, just like moon bases are, right? I don't know if it's true here in Russia, but I'm going to suspect that it is, that whenever science grants are written, and it has anything to do with space, in any way, whether, you know, it's physics or chemistry or astrobiology, whatever it might be, that somehow the moon base is written into that grant. And that's because it's a big seller. Everyone can get their minds around it. Because once grants get outside of peer review, it becomes a very different story of how to sell them, right? Peer-to-peer, you can be complicated, right? You can present your concepts in all its complexity, and it's fine. But then, once you get a bureaucrat ruling in on one, you better have something like the space station, because that's what they'll get. They're like, oh yeah, space station, that sounds like a good idea. It's a wonderful fantasy. So many people share it and love it. But, and we know theoretically it's possible to have a moon station or a Mars station. But when we think about it in terms of the actual engineering and logistics, it seems pretty impossible. In fact, at least in the US, when they tried it on Earth, they couldn't do it, right? How many people know this project, the biosphere? Just stunningly 80s science fiction. And what they thought they could do was to create an enclosed microenvironment that humans could live in and sustain themselves. And this is on Earth, right? And if you ever get out to Tucson, Arizona, please go see this. It's an amazing ruin. It's still half functioning, but it's really there as a kind of monument to human fantasy. So they got in there, and they got almost a year in. But what they forgot to account for, they made one engineering mistake, is how much oxygen the cement was going to absorb. And they found themselves running out of oxygen very quickly. So they had to put more in. Yeah, I think that's a very telling tale for me. How much oxygen are you going to need? Can we figure it all out? I mean, so that's just in addition to the logistical nightmare. But if anything is made for building, but anything is made in any other form of logistics and sustenance logistics, it's the same disaster. Now, Aubrey says that immortality should be coming in 15 years. But I don't see the possibility. I don't know how it can be real. And I think that the institutions that are being built to try and follow up on immortality are of the similar ilk of biosphere, a very strange kind of fantasy, though a compelling and weird one that seems worthy of attention. Ray Kurzweil, he's an immortalist too. He supports Aubrey de Grey's institute. Now, no one can say that Kurzweil is not a genius. You know, anyone that invents the flatbed scanner, certain synthesizers, has had such influence in artificial intelligence. You know, what can we say? The man is a very smart man that has made major contributions to the advancement of technology. However, that does not necessarily make one a good futurist. And certainly, Kurzweil loves to believe his own fantasies, right? So we have on one hand the hope that we can cure biological pathology, but Kurzweil will also throw in, and we remember these folks from the 80s and 90s, the extropians, right? And the extropians, what do they think they can do? They are of the belief that they can reconstitute their individual consciousness in the computer if you could just get a complex enough computer to do it, right? We could just get the complexity standard up. And of course, we know from Kurzweil, he's of the belief of, look, capacity, speed, memory, these things are going to progress geometrically. And so the possibility that computers could become smart enough to be able to reproduce consciousness seems possible. Although, you know, speed, memory, calculating power, these are not consciousness. I mean, funny, I mean, to talk about replicating it when our best scientists, philosophers, biologists haven't even figured out what consciousness is yet. We don't even know why we have it, how it could even possibly have evolved. It doesn't make any sense. So I don't have great hope for this area of the posthuman either. I think death is going to be in our life for a long time to come. Okay. In this case, those that have what some might call the anti-human future for us, that is where there aren't any humans left. And we find this typical of deep green resistance movement, right, Earth First movement. Those that are of the opinion that the sooner we can get humans out of nature, the better it's going to be for the cosmos, at the very least for the Earth. Now the deep ecology people, of which deep green resistance are kind of the very radicalized fringe, may possibly be right that, you know, wilderness is what we should protect. We have to tread lightly on the planet, right? We have to respect the inherent value of all living creatures. Okay, you know. But the problem that they don't ever explain is what to do about our population. Now, the radicals, of course, say, look, the crash is coming. The crash of humanity is inevitable. And so the quicker we can move this along, the better. The deep ecologists don't go along with that, really. They're like, no, that's not a good idea. We're not going to, destroy the Earth to help get rid of humans faster. Their opinion is that what needs to happen is that there will be some type of rational movement where people will come to understand that the world population needs to be around 100 million people. That's million, not billion, 100 million people. So where are the billions going to go? I don't really know. I don't know how that's going to happen. It would take, as the radicals say, some type of very crazy event that causes what they believe is the inevitable crash of humanity. And certainly, I gotta say, humans are looking bad. You can see how it comes to that. Whether there should be a species with consciousness that specializes in intelligence is a very questionable proposition. And we'll see. It is plausible that humans could be the most short-lived species to hit the planet, at least that we know of. That'll be quite a prize. So this one, I kind of pushed to the side because I don't know how they're ever going to figure out the numbers game of it, how you can get from billions to millions in any kind of intentional way. Okay, so is there any part of posthuman theory that I think is worth talking about? And the one that I would say yes is the second part of this talk, is internaturalism. That, I do think, has a possibility to it. That is there a way that we can rethink our relationship to other species and do it in a way that engages the organization of care on one hand and intentional symbiosis on the other? Okay. Having said that, let's start with the cautionary part. We're going to get that out of the way right away. And I'm going to tell you a story. A story about Kanzi the bonobo. Right? Kanzi's a very interesting ape. He has a lot of words, somewhere between 800 and 1,000. Because the one thing that has always separated us off, and the one thing that really makes some type of internaturalism not fully skewed, and it's going to always be skewed and anthropomorphic, anthropocentric to some degree. But it's this language problem, right? As humans are able to articulate their needs and desires in great detail, whether other species don't seem to be able to do it, and so we have to infer what it is they are trying to communicate. And those inferences obviously are going to always be more self-reflexive about who we are as humans rather than what is happening as animals. Now, Kanzi can articulate her needs and his needs and desires to some degree. Right. So, here's the interesting part of that. One day, Dr. Su there, who Kanzi considers to be part of his troupe, right, as do most of the humans that Kanzi works with on a daily basis. They live somewhat together and do function in an integrated troupe life. Dr. Su, who was at this particular point, outside Kanzi's visiting center. Kanzi's visiting center is a room with a big glass wall that divides it in half. And so if you or I went to the Ape Trust and said, I would like to speak with Kanzi, they would go and ask Kanzi, hey, there's a visitor, do you want to meet them? And if Kanzi said yes, they would bring her into this room, and he would say, let's talk to you. And you could talk back, but you would be separated by a plate of glass. So Su is on one side of the plate of glass. Kanzi is on another side of the plate of glass. And with him is another member of the troupe, a scientist that's there, named Bill Fields. And Su, on the other side of the glass from Bill and Kanzi, is having a very heated debate with a visiting colleague over methodologies of storing and interpreting data. Kanzi sees this and says to Bill, who Kanzi looks to as somewhat of an alpha male for the troupe, this is, already we're in trouble because we don't know what Kanzi really means, but I'm going to put an interpretation on it so the story can advance. Kanzi says, someone's out there hassling one of our troupe members. You need to do something about this. As the head of our troupe, you need to intervene here. All right? Now, the words weren't that complicated, but we suspect that that could be what Kanzi was trying to say. And Bill says back to Kanzi, no, I can't. And Kanzi says to Bill, if you don't do something about this, I'm going to bite you. Now, this is really interesting in terms of language, right? This is a contingent, future-oriented statement Kanzi's made. If you don't do X, you're going to get Y. And this is all future-oriented. So, we're talking pretty complex language abilities to be able to say something like that. Now, Bill says, in spite of this threat, I can't intervene because humans don't interrupt one another for this type of interaction. And that's where it's left. Now, Kanzi is a peaceful ape, has never fought with the other apes, has never fought with any of the humans, nothing. Later that day, when Su comes to see Kanzi and opens the door, Kanzi runs out, goes down to Bill Fields' office, opens the office door, jumps on his desk, grabs his hand, and bites his hand. And I don't mean just a little love bite. I mean an ape bite, which are serious. Mangles his hand and chops off one of his fingers. Okay, so, and then stops. That's it. That's the end of it. Does the bite, leaves. That's the end of it. Goes back to her area, his area. Sorry, I can't get the pronoun right. What just went on there? How do we interpret that? Now, Bill, of course, is quite mad about this and won't speak to Kanzi. Kanzi wonders, why do I not see Bill anymore? And Su says, well, you need to apologize to Bill because you bit him. And Kanzi says, I didn't do anything wrong. In other words, what seems to be the subtext, and here, here's the problem. How do we do these interpretations? What seems to be the subtext is he deserved it. He was letting one of our troupe get hassled. Right? What kind of alpha male behavior is that? He deserved to get bit. So, what are we tempted to do in terms of describing this relationship? What it seems like, at least in my fantasy, that I want to say, is that we have two systems of justice that clashed with one another, right? We have Kanzi's system of justice. That is, you don't allow outsiders to come in and disrupt the flow of our environment. And then we had human justice, which is certain behaviors are tolerated, even if they seem aggressive, and that you don't interrupt them, right? That you let the people who are having the debate or whatever complete that process. And these two things did not go together. So to me, this is like, a very cautionary story to when we start thinking about internatural relationships and how much layering we can start putting on to our relationships to other species. Because we don't know what they're thinking, and there is no good means for communication, and it leaves it very much open to incredible amounts of fantasy, which humans have an infinite capacity for, right? And then often to call our fantasies knowledge or inductive inference. Okay, so with that said, we can move on and say, all right, could there be projects that could be done that have an internatural layering to them? Right? And this is, I want to say yes, but remember, unlike cyborgs and immortals and extropians, I don't have any systematic agenda for this, right? These are only operational experiments that mean something in and of themselves. They don't necessarily connect to one another. And in fact, they could very well contradict one another. But on the ground, here's what we've been trying to do in line with this concept to show that perhaps there is a plausible model for action that could begin to redefine the relationship between species and relationship between landscape. Okay, so this is the kingdom of soy. It could be anywhere, right? If you look at that picture, there's no way you can tell where that is, right? It could be South America, it could be North America, it could be Russia, it could be India, it could be China. It could be anywhere, right? It happens to be in Argentina. It's the watershed region of Argentina. And if you go out to the watershed, you will find for miles and miles and miles nothing but the monocropping of genetically modified soy. And you find that in a lot of places. It's not peculiar to Argentina. And the other thing that you will find unusual is this kind of an internationalist homogenization. So if you had been out to this territory 50 years ago, it would have been filled with peasant farms and cattle ranches, right? Kind of the stereotype we think of the rural Argentine as the gaucho, the cowboy. There aren't any of those out there. They're all gone. All the peasants, they've been moved into the cities and are just packing the favelas. So these poor slums are just expanding out and expanding up. And what are the peasants going to do? I mean, they are farmers. They have no real business in the city. But they can't stay here. Why? Because this is farmed now and pretty much owned and controlled by a handful of multi-corporations. You know who they are: Monsanto, Cargill, DuPont. They're all out there, and they're all growing this single kind of crop and causing at the same time incredible social upheaval, right? This is kind of one of the great new forms of colonialism, of controlling the food sources and controlling the land. The lower picture, you can't really see it, but it's a gigantic, I mean huge soy processing plant. The reason it's taken from so far away is that's as close as we can get to it. The soy production plant is very well fortified, and they keep pretty much a private army in there. So if you get it all close to it, you will meet a militarized response. And that's all that's out there. There's also parking lots for all the trucks that move the soy to the processing plant and then to the docks for shipping. But that's it. It's the most awful form of what Guattari would call deterritorialization, that it has been wiped clean of all cultural reference, right? It's all gone. So, what do we do about this? And when we were in Argentina, we were working with a large number of collectives, artist collectives, scientists, ecologists, and so on, to try and develop a farm that could function for a family on just 10 hectares, right? We know with agrarian farming now, right, it's always scale up, scale up, scale up. The bigger the better, and the margin of profit is extraordinarily thin, but you do it on such a large scale, it's still very profitable. So we're looking at the other way. How can you repatriate the peasants back and get them out of the favelas? And for that, it was by doing grand diversity of farming with value-added product. But you can see here, like our garden, that's all done internaturally so that you didn't need to use any herbicides or pesticides. It's all done by plants that kind of help out other plants, usually by the rest of their particular ecology, by particularly the insects that hang out on them. If you get the right ones, you'll get the insects that will protect the neighboring plant from the insects that eat them, and vice versa. And that way, you can cut a huge expense by getting rid of herbicides. Animals, of course, you can sell, butcher and sell. But you also get manure so that you don't have to buy fertilizer, right? You can make your own. And so this was the whole idea. And the larger idea, and what makes this to me a very interesting internatural experiment, because as we know, farming is the oldest internatural relationship we have. Maybe pets are older, depending on how you define pets. But one of these two. I mean, these are the old traditional ones. But what made this one particularly interesting was not just that it was about, how do we integrate plants in a more sustainable way. It was that we could layer on top of this kind of win-win situation for the diversity of species out in this monocropped area, right? It was about more than that. It was more that layered on this is an actual plausible idea of revolution. Now, I don't know about you, but I thought political revolution, it was bracketed, right? 1789 to 1968, end of story. We're never going to see another real revolution again. But in Argentina, post-dictatorship, the apparatus of discipline has fallen apart. And so experiments like that, you can get away with them. If you tried this in the United States, you would be arrested so fast you wouldn't know what hit you. I don't know how it would be here, but somehow I suspect it would be similar. But there you can still get away with this. And what they're trying to brew is once that they can demonstrably show that a redivision of the land into these 10-hectare forms done using the right farming techniques, would mean that the kingdom of soy needs to be no more. And what they're convinced is that you could get a groundswell of peasants that could, one, lead a resistance in demanding a new way of redistributing the land, combined with a very thick residue of Peronism that is still there, right? Peron kicked out all the international corporations once, and there are many, many believers it can be done again, especially if you can prove that there's a plan B, right? That after they all leave, there's something that is viable and plausible that can be done to support people under the new situation, right? When that money, and it would be considerable, is all extracted from the economy. So this is a kind of internaturalism I hadn't really seen before that they were thinking about. It was really quite interesting to get to be a part of that. All right. This is another one that we tried to work out in Italy, another viable tactical option. And this, again, of trying in terms of organization of care and intentional symbiosis. How can a relationship between humans in a very precarious position, and plants, also in a very precarious position, strengthen one another through interrelation? So the idea was this, is we knew that there were, and this is in Turin, we knew that there, but it applies to almost every city, we knew there were numerous spaces that were under threat by developers. They were going to be appropriated, usually after people had done stuff, right? Squats, community gardens. What happens, you know? Neighborhood people get together, they make these nice gestures, and then some real estate broker comes in, buys up the property, and kicks everybody off it. Right? So this was definitely a problem in Turin, and like I said, in numerous places. And another problem they had was a great deal of endangered species, particularly plants, particularly in Piedmont region, a lot of the mountain flowers. So we chose one of those mountain flowers, Cupid's dart, and decided we can really collaborate with this plant because this plant is environmentally protected. That is, there are laws that if it's growing somewhere, you can't kill it. It has to be respected. So we thought, well, you know what would be a great idea then? First we have to learn how to grow it. And, you know, so we actually had a farmer come in and teach us how to grow this stuff. And we had to grow it wild. You can't grow it in a greenhouse because if you grow it in a greenhouse, it won't survive the transplant. The first winter, it'll all be dead. So, you know, what we thought was going to be a quick project turned into this long 1-year project. So we learned how to grow it and then picked our spots and went and planted it the following year. Now, theoretically, it sounds pretty good. And theoretically, the model is sound that if you have endangered species, the land can't be developed because the species has to be respected. So that which is going on there, right, whatever kind of social formation is taking place, gets to remain. And it's a win for the other because you take an endangered species and get to plant more of it. Right? Now, one of the important catches and why we couldn't do this in lots of places is that the endangered species has to be domesticated, right? Because you can't go out in the wild and take, an endangered species seeds. You would probably go to jail for that. So there has to be another way to get the seeds, and we were just very lucky. It's part of why we picked Cupid's dart, because it had been domesticated and seeds were available on the market. So it's, you know, it's kind of a win all around, right? It's this kind of layering of a different kind of relationship. In this case, not just for survival purpose, but also for political purpose. Okay, but unfortunately, I wish I could report that it all went great, and after we did that, no one was ever evicted from a squad again, or no community garden was ever bulldozed. But that's not what happened. We still do, in Italy anyway, live in the world of pan-capitalism. And what certainly happened is these real estate developers, they have lots and lots of money, and they have lots and lots of lawyers. And eventually, you can slow them down, but you can't stop them. So, you know, eventually, if we got injunctions so that they couldn't bulldoze, they eventually got them removed, right? You know, we lost all these battles. But we did slow them down. And the other thing that is good is there is a part two, because you can get one thing they hate just because of public relations, is they really hate it when you video them bulldozing endangered flowers. It looks really bad. I mean, talk about a very powerful representation if you want to make some green propaganda, is just show developers bulldozing endangered species. Yeah. They don't like that either. So you can slow the process. It is a way to kind of throw a wrench into the machine, but it's unfortunately not a way to stop the process. Okay, this was one that we did particularly to bother Monsanto, who's probably the most evil of all the biotech corporations, though it's very hard to say which one is on top. In this particular project, our idea was to find a way to kill Monsanto crops, and only kill Monsanto crops, no other life forms, and to do it in a way that is non-toxic. All right? Now, here's what has been happening. I don't know if you guys have seen this yet, but it's been fairly common in many countries in the world, is that Monsanto has a patent on their seeds, and lots of farmers grow them, and when they do, when it comes to pollination, the pollen blows all over the place. If you are an unfortunate farmer in the next field who is a traditional farmer or an organic farmer, the pollen will most likely blow onto your crops. So if you are doing organic soy or corn or canola, it will now, in the next generation, be genetically modified. Right? Those genes are passed on. They're germline genes that they put in to these products. Monsanto will go around to the neighboring fields, to their own, ones that are adjacent to their own, and test those crops. And when they find that some genetically modified crops are growing in that traditional farmer's lot, they will sue him. Right? You would think it would be the other way. You know, that pollen is flowing, and you know, seed banks that are centuries old are getting destroyed. You'd think it would be the farmer that would be suing Monsanto. But no, it's exactly the reverse. Monsanto sues the farmer, and that's how they break in. And they'll say, you know, I'll drop the lawsuit, but you need to start using our seeds now and pay us for using our seeds. So yeah, the farmer is really left with one of two choices: to either go broke trying to pay off legal fees, or to capitulate and begin to grow genetically modified food. Now, I don't worry about genetically modified food that much in terms of health crisis. I mean, you know, Lord knows the biggest longitudinal study ever of a product has been going on the past 20 years in the Americas. For at least 20 years now, people have been regularly eating genetically modified food, and it doesn't seem to be a disaster. However, the two other things which I think I've mentioned so far do bother me. And that is, one, that GM food kills the ecology of crop areas. It wipes everything out. It kills it all. And that's bad. That's bad for a lot of species. That's adding to our extinction rate. By that I mean the species of the world. That's a problem. And the second problem, that's a very big problem, that as, and it's maybe too late already, that as Monsanto and et al. And all the other corporations, handful of corporations that control the food supply, expand their grip more and more, and in more countries like Argentina or India, for example, they are beginning to control the food supply. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't want to give any corporation that kind of leverage where they can say who's going to eat and who is not, and who's going to get food and who is not. That sounds like a very dystopic world, but that is the world we are on our way toward. So, we decided we were going to provoke Monsanto. The Corcoran is, you know, this big America-centric museum in the middle of Washington, D.C. And we basically announced to the papers is that we are going to attempt to give farmers a kit through which they can fight back, and instead of, they'll kill your crops before you can kill theirs with disruptive and infected pollination. So our idea was a simple one. It's a great biohack, and we've tried to convince lots of other people to use it, although we have not been so successful. But we're very positive about the principle. And that is, in these modified plants, any trait of adaptability can become a trait of susceptibility. So what does that mean? It means that the way the Monsanto plant works, why it is immune to Roundup Ready herbicide, is because a gene has been put into it that protects it. It's a bacteria gene. So the way this plant works is it's resistant to an aromatic amino acid blocker. So a normal plant, when you spray Roundup on it, it needs to have aromatic amino acids to live, right? It's kind of one of the food of the plants. So if you starve it of it, if you put these blockers in and make it so that the plant cannot produce these amino acids anymore, it's basically going to die of starvation. That's how it works. Now, to stop it, they put a bacteria gene into the Monsanto plant. So what we thought, if we attack that bacteria gene, we can solely target the Monsanto plants, right? And it won't hurt anything else. It seemed like a good plan. And I think it was. I mean, like I said, the principle was right. Whether the actual tactical variation of attacking this particular bacterial gene fully worked, that may be questionable. So how do you do this? I mean, obviously, I'm not a scientist. And to really figure out how you would do that would take years of research, for sure. But I did have a good training in the humanities, which means I know how to do research. And what we did know was that when Monsanto patented this plant, they had to release all the information about that plant that they had gathered over the years and release all the experiments done, everything. And so we just went through that database and found the examples of where they were testing their product to see what would make it fail. And we finally found in that list one product that killed it and that wasn't toxic. And it was pyridoxal 5-phosphate, which is a kind of vitamin B. You can buy it in the health food store. And so that, combined with sunlight, once the crops were sprayed, it would kill those crops. Is that we could kill off the Monsanto plants. Monsanto did not take this very well. They first sent their lawyers over to tell us to cease and desist, which we didn't do. We refused to do. And happily, this is where we had the protection of the Corcoran Museum. Museums are still good for some things. They basically protected us because Monsanto could not afford the public relations problem it would have if it sued this museum. So we just kept running along with it. Now, as it happened, it would have been probably a year and a half later, I was arrested by the FBI for bioterrorism. So they caught up with us eventually. But I beat the charge. But still, no one wants to be arrested for that. It makes your life very difficult. But it's out there. And this I think, very good model for biohacking, politicized biohacking, through this internatural relation, has been, I hope, inspirational for some. But we need to work on it more. Biohacking needs to really reach the level that information and communication technology hacking is at. It's slow and it's behind. And it's partly because, unlike, we're all sitting here with computers and laptops and phones and the equipment, particularly the hardware, but also the software that's needed to do quality biohacking, they don't really want to give anybody, right? That's pretty much being kept in the hands of experts. So it's up to us to take it back, right? To get it out. This is too important to leave in the hands of scientists who are in the hands of the corporations and the military. If we're going to fight this back, we need to know how to do this ourselves. So a kind of amateurism, I suppose, is needed here. Gentera was a relationship we built with gut E. coli, right? Not the dangerous kind, the kind that lives in your stomach and intestines. And what we wanted to do with this was to find a way to explain to people about risk assessment in relation to genetically modified organisms, right? Because there's a lot of them out there. And the thing is we really need to be able to tell the difference between those that are probably okay versus the ones that are clearly pollutants for profit. But most people don't know. I mean, that the discussion has been somewhat skewed to the extremes of those that are like, no genetic modification at all. Well, that's too late. The genie's out of the bottle. We got to pick our battles here. Versus the corporate side of, we'll genetically modify whatever we want, we'll release it into the wild, and if there's a problem, we'll fix it later. Right? These are kind of the two kind of main arguments. We were trying to figure out, okay, how do we get people involved in a way that they can think reflectively about these and decide which are the most dangerous and which are the most problematic. Now, when you go out in the public and want to talk about transgenic organisms, very few people are interested in that. You know, you can see a small amount here tonight that are interested. Most people are not, though. They don't know what it is. They don't really care to know. So we had to find a way to convince people it was in their interest to know about this subject. And once you do that, learning is very easy. This is where we first off built this machine here, this little robotic arm. And we took some E. coli and we injected into it a fragment of human DNA. So in a very nominal way, it's probably exaggerating, we could say we have recombinant bacteria, right? Now, there's two things people tend to be very scared of. One is recombinant creatures, and two is bacteria. So we were doubling down on the fear factor, right? I mean, we can look at almost any mythology, and one of the consistent elements of it is that when humans begin to recombine natural things, monsters are born. Right? That's kind of where that fear comes from of the recombinant. Right? It's very, very deep in the majority of cultures. And then bacteria, well, you know, I mean, I don't know how many billions and billions of dollars the antiseptic business is worth at this point. And the tremendous amount of money that it spends every year to convince us that germs are after us, right? And that we should be very afraid of them and buy all of these products that are going to sterilize our environment so the germs won't get us, right? Now, we all know that bacteria are the foundation of every ecological system. There could be no life on Earth without bacteria as the base. And we've evolved to live with them quite peacefully and comfortably. We have trouble with a few of them. A small, tiny fragment of them we have problems with. And when they get in the wrong place in our body, that can be bad too. But mostly we cope with them quite well. But it doesn't matter. Everyone knows what it's like to have an infection or to be very ill. And that helps build this fear factor. So when we told people at a farmer's market or a natural history museum or a public park or wherever we would go, we're about to release some recombinant bacteria, they became very interested right away in what we were doing and what we had to say, because they had an immediate stake in it of like, do I need to run away? Is what's being done here dangerous? Do I need to get my kids out of here? Right? A lot of questions come up, and when you say, well, look, I can provide you with answers of what we're doing and how we're doing it and why we're not doing it this way, it makes it very, quite possible for a kind of dialogue to happen that would be otherwise absolutely impossible. And, what made that kind of political and economic discussion possible was our kind of relationship that we had to this particular bacteria and vice versa, right? Again, this organization of care is we help its species continue along as well. So as people got more and more comfortable with it, they could then come into the tent and, we would even let them make their own dish of it to take home. Take it home as a domestic pet, right? Oh, and bacteria maybe should be pets more. That's how we knew that they were thinking through, and the fear that they started with, we would neutralize at the end, and the fear would be replaced with knowledge, right? Always a good thing. Can't go wrong with that formula. All right, last one. We could go on, but probably don't need to. I think you guys have the hang of it by now. This is Peep Under the Elbow that we did in Hamburg. And this was one, I put this one in because it's about how people finding a way to design a new relationship for people with their environment, and in particular, their geographic relationships in their environment. This was done in a neighborhood called Wilhelmsburg, and for those of you that know Hamburg, know that that's the island in the center of the Elbe. The Elbe splits and goes around it, and most of it is a port. So if you're in Hamburg proper, and you look across the Elbe, what you see is all the port containers and the ships and the docks. You don't really see what else is there. And if you ever wondered, like I did, the many times I went to Hamburg, where do all the poor people live? It's Wilhelmsburg. That's where they live. Past that port, once you get to the other side of it, it's miles of public housing in which the working poor, the elderly, and immigrants live. That's kind of where they're all shipped into. There's one way out. There's one road out. So it's very difficult to get in there. It's very difficult to get out of there. So you have a lot of poor people. They're kind of trapped on this island. And they're using the resources they have. And one of the resources they have is the waterways, the creeks and the canals. The unfortunate thing is these creeks and canals are so horribly polluted that probably no one should mess with them at all. But you can't say that to someone. You can't say to someone of limited resources who have this one water resource, you know what would be the good thing is if you just forget about it. Yeah, that's not helpful. So what we thought we would do then is test all the water to find out where the most toxic places are. And some of them were horrendously toxic. Now what had happened is the island in the middle of the Elbe was acting as a kind of natural filter for the river. And so all the toxins coming downriver ended up in Wilhelmsburg, in these waterways. Now when it was particularly bad was when Germany was still split, and East Germany had absolutely no rules about the use of chemical fertilizer. And that chemical fertilizer was running off the fields into the river and then finding itself caught up in this island filter of Wilhelmsburg. And so consequently, the silt in the bottom was an 8+, which is the highest rating of toxicity something can have. I mean, it was off the charts dangerous. And we went to the water board in Hamburg. They made no bones about it. They showed us all the studies that they had done on it. And I said, well, are you going to ever clean it up? And they said, no, it's beyond repair. We can't clean it up. So we knew about the silt. We knew people were fishing and eating the fish out of this area. So we actually went to just the water itself because people were swimming in it. And you can see this one down here. This was actually a beach that was very popular. Lots of people swimming in this particular canal. In addition to the silt problem, it was filled with arsenic. The arsenic was leaching off the ship's paint that was parked in the canal all the time. So, I mean, it was basically swimming in liquid poison. So we made maps and found the least toxic place and the most toxic place and said, if you're going to go swimming, here are the beaches to go into. Your health will thank you. And on the other end, we went, if you're going to go fishing and you're going to eat the fish, and for some people they were going to, it's their only source of protein. They couldn't afford fish otherwise. We said, just, keep them small, and here are the better areas. Right? So watch out. Although the only thing we were prescriptive about is we recommended never eating the eels, because those things were just poisonous. Eels have a very, very high fat content, and that fat just absorbs all of the toxins. Right? So it's just like, please, stay away from those. Okay, so what I hope we all get is that there is a kind of modeling of a different kind of relationship, and perhaps a slightly decentered relationship that we can have with other species that is mutually productive, and that also can be layered into it other elements of social behavior and discourse beyond that of production and consumption. And this is why, of kind of all the post-human conditions I laid out, this one, though it is systematically problematic, at least operationally can function at a tactical level. And that's part of what we've been trying to demonstrate over the past 10 years or so. So thank you for sitting through it all. Hopefully it was somewhat enlightening. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer.
У меня вопрос, как вы относитесь к практикам типа группы Тикун, которые занимаются, собственно, городским таким вандальным озеленением и радикальным садоводством, собственно, в городе, то, что вот примерно вы показывали ваш проект в Турине. Но вы, собственно, использовали какое-то растение из Красной книги, как я понимаю. Они же, собственно, используют там плодовые растения, овощи и так далее, собственно, переводя фермы в город. Как вы, собственно, к этим практикам относитесь?
Well, the green practices, I think, have been very helpful. And one of the ways that they're most helpful is it helps recruit people very quickly, you know, because it's something that you can do. So that, gardening and guerrilla gardening in urban environment. It brings people to the movement. And, you know, the very radical kind of experiments that have been going on, you know, I think like Natalie Jeremijenko is a very good example, are good. You know, they help, they contribute. So I have no problem with it at all. I mean, I hope people can move to more experimental means, but this is, you know, that's the gateway to internatural relationships that, again, are beyond production and consumption, and that engage intentional symbiosis. And, you know, anytime I see that, I think that's immensely positive.
Сейчас попробую сформулировать. На примере проекта. Вот есть проект Пинар Йолдыш, экосистема эксцессов. Она представила вот как бы некую такую воображаемую экосистему организмов живых, которые развелись вот, ну, на Земле, вот, уже заполненной пластиком. То есть это такая иллюзия. Вот это ее такое решение проблемы, которую вы тоже сегодня обозначили. Как бы вы могли предложить, ну точнее не как бы вы могли предложить, как вы видите вот решение этих проблем, помимо тех каких-то локальных, может быть, проектов, которые вы делаете, как в целом, ну такой философский вопрос, куда мы движемся, какие у нас там перспективы, как у человечества?
Yeah, okay, that's always the difficult question. And I tried in this talk to present two models, right? Where I started with Argentina, which is the strategic model, right? It's very long term, it's all in, it's the only project that they do. And we'll see. You know, it seems like you would see, at least on a nationwide basis, is what they're aiming at. That's a pretty large unit to say we're going to try and change the economic structure of a country. So that's one. But mostly I think what we can do now, given our strengths, that we're still a minority, are tactical projects. You know, so they're going to be much more local and specific. The thing that we have to remember, though, so that we don't get demoralized, is I am a believer in indeterminacy, right? You know, I don't think you always have to have a strategic plan for an emergent result that is positive to occur. And so if we take and think about all of the people who are doing tactical works, even if they're not coordinated, over time, those tactical works add up. And when we look at them in aggregate, it does have a force of change. Because, like I said, for some of these, we just don't have the option of strategic action. In the U.S., we don't. There's no institutional basis, right? There's no infrastructure that we can go to because, all that infrastructure is in on the conspiracy, right? So, I mean, as activists, we're working completely independently. And, the only thing we can do is, like I said, hopefully believe. And the example I would cite recently was the New York Occupy Wall Street movement, right? They said, we're not going to have any leaders. We're not going to have the list of demands. We are just out here doing an alternative lifestyle. And whatever discourse emerges from that, great. I can tell you for the United States, it was great because for the first time ever, a real mainstream public discussion of wealth inequality is happening. And that wasn't done by anyone making strategic demands or a strategically coordinated campaign. It was done purely just by example. It was done through a principle of indeterminacy. So I don't see the situation as hopeless, but we're up against bad odds. And like I said, I tried to show what I think in this lecture. I tried to show what I think can be done and where it can be done. The faster the structure of discipline breaks down in those places, that's where we can do more strategic actions. Where the structure of discipline is really intense, like in the United States, it's almost hopeless. You're going to jail. I get arrested anytime I do anything. So that's the best I can answer that question.
Спасибо большое за лекцию. У меня немножко наивный, наверное, вопрос. Вот этот проект, он, как вы позиционируете его? Он больше задает вопросы или он дает ответы? Потому что появилось ощущение, что цель его улучшить мир, и в этом он немножко похож на проекты природоохранных организаций. И я хотела бы понять, просто это в большей степени такой межкультурный проект между человеком и природой, или же это все-таки попытка поменять наше будущее, и в таком случае он больше похож на, не знаю, мировоззрение 60-х, 70-х годов, когда люди возвращались к природе?
The answer is both. We want to improve relationship among the species, but we're very committed to political activism as well. And it's, the question for us is, how do you make that work together in some symphonic type of way? It's both. It's not a naive question at all. And what we're trying to get at is something related to the natural, but also to the cultural. And the feeling that they are fundamentally inseparable, though we try to categorize them differently, but they're an extension of one another. So trying to work from that assumption. By way of asking about my background, I'm no great lover of nature. I'm not like one of these deep ecology people that goes camping all the time and hiking in the woods and mountain climbing and communing with nature. I don't do any of that. I'm an urban guy. But I still worry about these things along. I mean, contemporary agriculture is kind of a disaster at this point. And it affects everything from the wilderness, as we could see in the kingdom of soy, all the way to what's landing on our table and what is our relationship to food in cities. So, I kind of see it as we have to embrace it all and start to rethink these particular kind of models on a more integrated basis, and stop particularly with this duality that there's nature over here and culture over here. They're just so overwhelmingly together now. I mean, it's very much like when you're in a cosmopolitan city, it's ridiculous to say, you know, there's Asian people here, and European people here, and there's Americans here. They're all relating to one another and influencing one another, and there's this tremendous amount of interculturalism. And, you know, it's the same thing with the relationship of culture and nature. It's just inseparable. And we need to think about it that way, even if you're like me, and primarily, or like you here in Moscow, in a primarily an urban environment.
Мне просто показалось, что если речь о решении этих проблем, то в проекте как будто бы немного не хватает социальной поддержки или социальной заинтересованности всех людей, которые участвуют в таком процессе уничтожения природы вокруг.
Yeah, well, that's what I tried to show in this one, in Gentera. How do you get people interested? And the way you have to do that is you have to show them how they have an immediate stake in it, right? And that's always the trick. To any of our performances, interventions, or provocations, the fundamental thing is that you have to have something, even if it's a trick, to bring people into that conversation. So in Gentera, they said when we start talking about genetically modified bacteria, which seemed incredibly dangerous to the people I was talking to, even though it wasn't dangerous at all, we could bring them into the conversation. This is a project I didn't talk about, but this is one where we offered to test people's food to see if it's genetically modified. And in Europe, this was an important question because supposedly genetically modified food is labeled as such, right? Or if it's not, it's like, you know, it's organic, there's no GMOs in it. So, but when we tell people, you want to be sure, let us test it. And that would open up much larger dialogues. And those much larger dialogues, like I said, it changes consciousness when we're lucky, and when we're really, really lucky, it makes people behave different. And if we're even luckier, it makes them act in a new and positive way. So, but the start of it all, and we learned this from Theater of the Oppressed, the start of it all is making sure there is a way that the person that comes to the dialogue can concretely connect themselves to the dialogue right away. And, you know, like I said, and that's the real artistry of a lot of these projects, is figuring out what that is. It's figuring out how do we make a representation that someone is going to relate to instantly and want to talk about it. And to do it in a way that's not propaganda, that at the end what they come out with is knowledge, not being brainwashed.
Я хочу задать вопрос. Вы вначале сказали, что если человеку вживляется имплант, то он становится киборгом. Мы его категоризируем. А как быть в этом случае, например, с трансгендерными людьми, которые сделали операцию? Назвать их киборгами — это будет нетолерантно, и это будет не гуманистически. Что вы думаете по этому поводу?
И нельзя ли вообще все модификации, импланты, что касается не только изменения пола, но вживления уха себе в руку или каких-то рогов, к примеру, назвать творческим приспособлением к реальности и видению себя, и свободному самовыражению. И также и продолжить называть это человеческим, просто расширять поле понимания. Спасибо.
Oh, well, that's a serious political battle, isn't it? I mean, with transgender people, I don't think that we can call them cyborgs at all. I mean, not just because it's not of the model, that everything they're doing has to do with organic adjustments, you know, and surgery. That's a very difficult thing, but one that to me stands outside of the posthuman question. I mean, you know, that's where the insult would be, not calling them cyborgs, but calling them posthuman. And that seems to be where the political struggle is that there are lots of people that want to say trans people are not human, that they've crossed over the boundary. And that's the point of conflict, in my opinion. That's the real troublesome area, is that, no, again, this should be well within the standard of what human is. And that the flexibility we expect with identity in some areas should be applied to all areas. So if we want to say have tremendous flexibility in how we present ourselves to the world in terms of our occupation, and that can change and evolve over time and be one thing one day and completely different the next, why should that, and that's human, why should that not equally apply to gender transformation? Well, there's a lot of folks that just want to say, yeah, the occupation's good, gender no. But that's the struggle, is not to is to keep trans out of the posthuman category and see it as part of what makes us human, our capability for flexibility, a capability for cognition. That means we can rethink ourselves all the time. We don't have to be an animal that, you know, once you're an ant, you're always an ant, right? There's no changing that. But part of what makes humans humans, you know, and much like saying death, is this possibility of flexibility. And it's nothing but unfortunate that there are those that won't be consistent with that principle. And we need to point out that contradiction.
Еще вопросы? Нет? Все? Никто не хочет?
All right, let's drink beer.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.